Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is James Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, I'm going to be talking about my Week 8 wide receiver rankings for the 2023 fantasy football season. Over the course of today's episode, I'm covering all topics related to the wide receiver position, beginning with matchups, talking about which defenses thus far this season on average have been allowing the most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers so that we can identify the most advantageous matchups going into the given week. After which, I'll mention my top 45 wide receiver rankings. I'll share with you guys my thought process and opinions on each individual wide receiver while also presenting statistics in order to justify their current rankings. With no teams on bye, there are a lot of wide receivers that you can justify starting in your leagues this upcoming week. So I wanted to go ahead and talk about a broader spectrum of wide receivers up to wide receiver 45 on today's episode. Now, if you're looking for a specific wide receiver, there are timestamps down in the description of the video. While you're down there, of course, subscribe, like, comment down below. I greatly appreciate it. But again, there is a lot of wide receivers to talk about. So let's immediately get into talking about matchups so that we can get on to talking about each individual player that we have ranked for this upcoming week. All right, as you guys can see to the right side of the screen, wide receiver receiving statistics allowed thus far this season on average, the Los Angeles Chargers, Pittsburgh Steelers, Philadelphia Eagles, they are giving up the most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. Of course, we've most recently seen guys like Rashee Rice play well against the Los Angeles Chargers. Puka Nacua had himself an incredible game against the Pittsburgh Steelers. The Philadelphia Eagles, they have to give up their fair share of points to guys like Tyreek Hill. But even against lesser wide receiver options, they have still given up their fair share of points. They've brought in a little bit of secondary help with Kevin Byard, the trade that they made earlier this week. Either way, just want to give you guys some perspective as to the most advantageous matchups going into the given week. I'll reference back to these statistics over the course of today's episode, but I also want to talk about some of the more difficult matchups going into the week. The New York Jets secondary, obviously coming off of the bye, we should see Reed and Gardner both healthy for the cornerback position of this defense, which certainly is going to make it extremely difficult for the wide receivers of, the New York Giants, but none of us are really consistently starting those wide receivers unless we really have to do apocalypses or injury situations. The Dallas Cowboys have played extremely well against opposing wide receivers. So have the Cleveland Browns. Even though the Cleveland Browns gave up a touchdown to both Josh Downs, Michael Pittman Jr., they're not perfect, but typically, they've been pretty good against opposing wide receivers thus far this season. We'll see how the Seattle Seahawks wide receivers fare in the given week. Either way, I just wanted to go ahead and present these statistics. Let's go ahead and let's begin talking about my top 45 wide receiver rankings. A reminder, for those of you who are trying to stay up to date on my latest rankings, besides subscribing to the channel, checking out Patreon, you can also travel down to the description of the video and get my rankings every single Sunday morning via Underdog Fantasy. If you sign up today using code ANJU and make a first-time deposit minimum of $10, not only are you going to get the first-time deposit match up to $500, so you can go ahead and draft teams, put together some pick'em slips via Underdog Fantasy, but you're also going to get my rankings sent from my email directly to yours every single Sunday morning, which consists of by position, by tier, half PPR, full PPR, top 100 flex rankings. So regardless of what you're doing on Sunday mornings, you have an advantage upon your league mates. Be sure to check out the map to the right side of the screen to determine your eligibility based on your location. Take advantage of the opportunity of not only going ahead, getting the rankings every single week, but of course participating in the pick'ems game going into this upcoming Thursday. If you sign up as a new customer, make that first time deposit using code ANJU, you'll be able to get Josh Allen 0.5 total yards against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers and start off your underdog journey correctly. Be sure to go ahead and check that out. Thank you very much for the support. All right, let's get into talking about my top 45 wide receiver rankings, beginning with our number one. We have A.J. Brown. A.J. Brown has been unbelievable as of late. 5 consecutive games of over 125 receiving yards, coming off of a performance against the Miami Dolphins secondary. 10 catches, 137, and a touchdown. Now he has the privilege of taking on the Washington Commanders for the second time this year. Earlier this season against that secondary, had a monster performance of 9 catches for 175 and 2 touchdowns, literally scored 34 fantasy points. And the fact of the matter is the Washington Commanders secondary cannot stop a soul. They're not only the 6th best matchup at the wide receiver position, they're allowing nearly 33 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. And most recently, regardless of how talented wide receivers are, they've been giving up a fair share of yards. Marvin Mims, 113. Jalen Hyatt, 75. Drake London, 125. DJ Moore, 230. Stephon Diggs, 111. There have been a lot of wide receivers that have found success. And going up against this matchup, once again, they're familiar with one another. I'm anticipating A.J. Brown to have himself another big performance against the division rival. Moving on to our number 2, we have Tyreek Hill, the guy that is potentially in line to breaking the wide receiver receiving yard records. And even though his receiving yard total wasn't incredible against the Philadelphia Eagles, he still had 11 catches on 15 targets, 88 yards, and a receiving touchdown. Even had a first touchdown called back early in the first quarter of that game due to an offensive holding penalty. Could have had himself 2 touchdowns minimum within the overall contest. He has had himself 3 consecutive games of over 20 fantasy points. In those last 3 weeks, a 34% target share within this offense. They take on the New England Patriots. The New England Patriots in week 2 against the Miami Dolphins held Tyreek Hill to 12.5 fantasy points, 5 catches, 40 yards, and a touchdown. That's primarily because Christian Gonzalez was shadowing him for the entirety of that game. Christian Gonzalez is on the injured reserve. It's going to be tough for Bill Belichick and the secondary to be able to slow down Tyreek Hill. Moving on, we have Stefon Diggs as our number 3. Talking about consistent wide receivers. Thus far this season, amongst all wide receivers, Stefon Diggs is number 2 across the board in targets, receptions, and receiving touchdowns. He's number 4th amongst all wide receivers in receiving yards. He continues to ball out every single week and has an opportunity going into Thursday on a short week to put up another great performance. Against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, all elite wide receivers have found themselves a lot of success. Justin Jefferson, 9 catches for 150. DJ Moore, 6 catches for 104. AJ Brown, 9 catches for 131. Amon-Ra St. Brown, 12 catches, 124, and a touchdown. The Bucs are allowing the 11th most points to opposing wide receivers. Stefon Diggs has been on a hot streak already thus far this season. I'm sure that the Buffalo Bills want to get back on track. Again, they have not played up to their overall standard over the course of the last 3 games, but considering how bad their defense has played, it's only going to keep them in contests and, of course, forcing Josh Allen and Stefon Diggs to have to continue to carry this team every single week. He had a couple deep, passing target opportunities last week, as you guys can tell via the chart, via Next Gen Stats as of last week. A lot of opportunities. If he makes one of those catches again, is even better within the given week. Moving on to our number 4, we have Ja'Marr Chase. Coming off the bye week, we have another week in which Joe Burrow is healthy, and that is only going to expand the potential opportunities of Ja'Marr Chase within this offense. Thus far this season, since week 2, Ja'Marr Chase has been averaging 14 targets, 10 catches, 122 receiving yards, 0.75 touchdowns per game, and 21.65 fantasy points per game in a half PPR scoring format. They have an opportunity of taking on the San Francisco 49ers. That 49ers secondary looked awful on Monday night. They cannot cover Jordan Addison. So imagine what Ja'Marr Chase and T. Higgins are about to accomplish against that defense. Addison went for 7 catches, 123, and 2 touchdowns. You could call that one touchdown that he had where he was fighting for the ball a fluke, but nonetheless, he was able to carve up this defense. Amari Cooper, 4 catches for 108. Marquise Hollywood Brown, 7 catches for 96. Michael Wilson in the same game, 7 catches, 76, and 2 touchdowns. Puka Nacua, 15 catches for 145 against the 49ers defense. Everyone's balling out against that secondary. Ja'Marr Chase is another man on a mission. Moving on to our number 5, we have Cooper Kupp. Even though Cooper Kupp had himself only 5.9 fantasy points, I want you to understand that Cooper Kupp very rarely has these lackluster performances. Very rarely. And yes, Puka Nacua was able to accumulate majority of the yardage, and him being there certainly does, at least allow this offense to continue to be relevant. But understand that the last time we saw Cooper Kupp have a single-digit performance was back in week 4 of 2021. So it is very rare that he ever puts up performances as such. Now, going into this upcoming weekend's matchup against the Dallas Cowboys, the last time he took on this Cowboys defense, week 5 of 2022, 7 catches, 125, and a touchdown, 22.4 fantasy points. Yes, he did have a 75-yard receiving touchdown, would definitely skew his numbers, but nonetheless, he has found success against the secondary. They're comfortable against it. The Cowboys thus far this season, amongst all teams in the National Football League, they run the second most cover 1 and the second most man coverage, only behind the Browns in both of those categories. A lot of man coverage. I don't think they'll be able to slow down Cooper Kupp in that capacity. Moving on to our number 6, we have Amon-Ra St. Brown. Just look at the overall routes that Amon-Ra St. Brown is running. He is an absolute monster. He continues to ball out every single week. 2 consecutive weeks, week 6 and 7, where he's just dominating. In the last 2 weeks, accumulating 34 targets, 25 receptions, 226 receiving yards, and 1 receiving touchdown. He continues his streak in 2023 of at least having either 100 plus receiving yards or at least 1 touchdown in a game. He'll continue to find him success this upcoming week taking on the Las Vegas Raiders. Their primary nickel cornerback, Nate Hobbs, has missed the last 4 games, hasn't played since week 3 due to an ankle injury. If he is not back, and even if he is back, I don't think anybody can slow down Amon-Ra St. Brown and his overall upside as he continues to get peppered with an incredible volume of targets every single week. Moving on to our number 7, we have Puka Nacua. Puka Nacua balled out against the Pittsburgh Steelers defense, and though they were taking some shots at him, he continued to get up and he continued to make plays. Now, one of the craziest statistics that I'll probably mention over the course of today's entire episode is the fact that from weeks 1 through 5, without Cooper Kupp in the lineup, Puka Nacua had himself a 31% target share within this offense. Since the return of Cooper Kupp from weeks 6 and 7, Puka Nacua has had a 36% target share. His target share has only increased in the return of Cooper Kupp. Cooper Kupp is pulling a lot of coverage, and on top of it, it is allowing Puka Nacua to play in the slot position even more. From weeks 1 through 5, was only playing in the slot 30% of the time. That number has jumped in the last 2 weeks to 45% of the time. A lot of one-on-one coverage, taking on a man, priority defense. Again, playing a lot of cover one, a lot of man coverage within the given week. I'm expecting Cooper Kupp to allow Puka Nacua on the opposite side of the field to continue to eat every single week as his targets continue to flow at such a high rate. Moving on to our number 8, we have Keenan Allen. Keenan Allen, for 2 consecutive games, has had Justin Herbert overthrow a touchdown, which is absolutely painful. But we all know that Keenan Allen is going to continue to be the primary number one of this offense, and this offense has a great opportunity this week taking on the Chicago Bears. The Chicago Bears, as of late, have been incredible in terms of stopping the run, and that may go ahead and slow down Austin Eckler to an extent, which will only open up more opportunity for Keenan Allen in the receiving game. I mean, in 5 of the last 6 games he has played, he has had himself 9 or more targets. He's going to continue to see a high volume of opportunity. Hopefully, Justin Herbert's going to be able to find himself a little bit more consistency, not throw the ball 10 yards over the head of Keenan Allen, especially when he's wide open in the end zone. If we go ahead and complete those plays, I'm not complaining. He's a top 10 ranked player every single week because we know his potential for upside either way. I think the matchup in itself, on top of the fact that he's continuing to see a high volume of targets, continues in this conversation. Moving on to our number 9, playing on Thursday Night Football, we have Mike Evans. Mike Evans, in the last 5 healthy games he has played for this organization, of course, excluding the game he played against the New Orleans Saints, in which he got injured and left the game, he has been averaging himself 9.2 targets, 5.4 receptions, nearly 86 receiving yards, 0.8 receiving touchdowns. Again, that's 4 touchdowns in the last 5 games, and 16.06 fantasy points per game. Unbelievable numbers. He's coming off another great performance, 6 catches, 82 and a touchdown, 17 fantasy points. Can we ask for more from Mike Evans, the future Hall of Famer? I mean, just in those games, he's been able to get himself not only 8+ targets in every single contest, but a 27% target share. They take on the Buffalo Bills secondary, who of course have been dealing with a lot of injuries. Tre'Davious White being absent in the last 3 games has allowed wide receivers like Darius Slayton to have 69 receiving yards. Again, Darius Slayton doesn't do anything typically. We saw Calvin Ridley, 7 catches, 122 against that defense. Kendrick Bourne, 6 catches for 63 and a touchdown. There's a lot of upside within the given week for Mike Evans once again. Moving on to our number 10, Davante Adams. I primarily rank Davante Adams in this position out of respect. He is an elite wide receiver. He is one of the best in the National Football League. It's just a matter of, is Jimmy Garoppolo going to target him? I mean, in the last 2 games with backup quarterbacks, we saw Brian Hoyer target him 12 times, and Aiden O'Connell target him 13 times. And the fact that we have seen Jimmy Garoppolo not get up to those numbers on a consistent basis with Davante Adams is alarming. Hopefully Jimmy Garoppolo is going to lock it in this week, be healthy, and execute the offense as it's meant to be, to throw the ball in the direction of their best overall receiver and allow Davante Adams to carve up the Detroit Lions secondary. Again, the Detroit Lions defense as a whole, exceptional at stopping the run. That'll only continue to force this offense into an air raid situation where they're going to have to throw for majority of the game. And in that case, of course, upside will be on the table for someone like Davante Adams. Look at his overall route chart. He literally only played on the left side. And still, again, a lot of the overall opportunities he was given were off target. A lot of bad passing attempts from Brian Hoyer. But when we get Jimmy Garoppolo back into the offense, hopefully it'll elevate his overall play. Moving on to our number 11, beginning the B tier, we have CeeDee Lamb. Coming off of the bye week. Again, CeeDee Lamb is a great wide receiver. He just needs consistent opportunity. The last time out, 7 catches, 117, 0 touchdowns, but 15.2 fantasy points against the Los Angeles Chargers secondary. Now he takes on the Los Angeles Rams secondary, which is significantly better. But we have seen number 1 wide receivers take care of this overall matchup. I mean, guys like Jamar Chase, 12 catches for 141. A.J. Brown, 6 catches for 127. Last week, George Pickens, 5 catches for 107. Even Deontay Johnson on the opposite side of the field, 5 catches for 79 receiving yards. And when you take into account the fact that the Pittsburgh Steelers didn't even have any sort of offense in the first 3 quarters, and majority of it came in the 4th quarter alone, there is a potential in which, of course, CeeDee Lamb early and often within the matchup can find himself a lot of success. As of thus far this season, the primary coverage the Rams are playing are 2 high safeties 45% of the time and zone coverage 76% of the time. This is just going to be a matter of, can he beat these zone coverages? Thus far this season, according to PFF, he's got a pretty good score against zone coverage. CeeDee Lamb should have himself a fantastic performance coming off the bye. Moving on to our number 12, we have Brandon Ayuk. Prior to today's recording, I did see a report in which, unfortunately, Brock Purdy is on the concussion protocol. Concussion protocol thus far this season, on average, has forced every single player to miss at least 1 week. With that being said, there is a potential that Brock Purdy could play. And if he does, of course, Brandon Ayuk is a fantastic player. But even in his absence, I still do believe that Sam Darnold can elevate Brandon Ayuk. I mean, we're talking about the fact that Deebo Samuel is going to miss another consecutive week because, again, he's dealing with that shoulder injury. On top of it, when you go back to 2022, Sam Darnold, weeks 15 through 17, fantasy football playoffs, for many of us who remember having DJ Moore, Throughout those 3 weeks, DJ Moore was the number 4 overall wide receiver, averaging 18 fantasy points per game. Sam Darnold is a capable quarterback, so I'm sure within this scheme, he'll be able to find himself a lot of success. According to ESPN Analytics, thus far this season amongst all wide receivers, Brandon Ayuk has been the most open wide receiver amongst all in terms of routes ran and being open on said routes. There's a potential in which, of course, Brandon Ayuk has himself another great week here. Unfortunately, last week, Monday Night Football, he literally didn't have a singular reception in the second half. I did not anticipate that happening in any sort of regard. It was quite unfortunate, but I'm assuming it's because Brock Purdy was concussed throughout that game. Moving on to our number 13, the thumbnail of today's episode, we have Adam Thielen. Adam Thielen is an absolute monster. From weeks 2 through 6, he has been averaging 11.4 targets, 9.4 receptions, 99.4 receiving yards, 0.8 receiving touchdowns, and 19.96 fantasy points per game, and is the number 5 overall ranked wide receiver in fantasy points per game throughout that span of time, weeks 2 through 6. The only reason that I'm excluding week 1 is because he was dealing with an ankle injury. He didn't practice for majority of the week, still suited up in that game, and obviously he didn't look great because of said injury, but since then has looked incredible. Adam Thielen is a monster, and even though the Carolina Panthers are going to be changing their active play caller from Frank Reich, their head coach, to now their offensive coordinator, Thomas Brown. Thomas Brown comes from the Sean McVay coaching tree. He was with the Los Angeles Rams from 2020 through 2022. And what do they love to do? They like to scheme up this offense to get guys like Cooper Kupp open. Therefore, I'm anticipating that Adam Thielen will continue to cook within this offense and have himself a great week coming off of the bye. Number 14, we have Jakobi Meyers. Last Sunday, somebody asked me during our live stream, Andrew, why did you move up Jakobi Meyers so much from Wednesday going to Thursday? And like I mentioned, rankings are always subject to change. But the reason why I said I moved him up is because I was worried that there was a potential in which this offense is purely predicated on using Davante Adams to open up opportunities for Jakobi Meyers. And once again, for another week, that came to fruition, even without Jimmy Garoppolo in the lineup. 13 targets, 7 catches, 50 yards, and a touchdown, 14.5 fantasy points for Jakobi Meyers, who continues to ball out every single week, has an opportunity of taking on the Lions secondary, which again is the only point in which they'll be able to find success in terms of dominating this defense. The expectation is that Jakobi Meyers with Jimmy Garoppolo should have himself another incredible game. Thus far this season with Jimmy Garoppolo active, Jakobi Meyers is averaging 9.75 targets, 7 receptions per game, 76 receiving yards per game, 1 receiving touchdown per game, and 17.05 fantasy points per game in a half PPR scoring format. Moving on to our number 15, we have Jordan Addison. I did not anticipate Jordan Addison having a 2 receiving touchdown game against the San Francisco 49ers. Not in any sort of capacity, but my goodness, did he have himself a career day. 7 catches, 123, 2 touchdowns. I mean, he has gone ahead and already tied Randy Moss's record for most receiving touchdowns in the first 7 games of a rookie wide receiver's career. Tying records with Randy Moss just kind of gives you an understanding as to what we're looking at here from Jordan Addison, who obviously is going to continue to get himself a higher volume of targets in the absence of Justin Jefferson. This upcoming week, they take on the Green Bay Packers. Their secondary is dealing with a lot of injuries. One of their starting cornerbacks and, of course, one of their starting safeties aren't going to be playing this upcoming week. That's only going to open up opportunity. And sure, Jair Alexander will be available and probably looking to lock down Jordan Addison, but what are we to do? We have to start him. This man is literally scoring nearly a touchdown every single game thus far this season. He's going to be in our lineup. Luckily for Jordan Addison taking on the Green Bay Packers, they've given up their fair share of points to opposing wide receivers. Sutton this last week, 6 catches, 76 and a touchdown. Meyer, 7 for 75 and a touchdown. Amon-Ra, 5 for 56 and a touchdown. Chris Olave, 8 for 104. And Drake London closing it out with 6 catches, 67 and a touchdown. We have seen wide receivers play well against the Green Bay Packers. We're hoping for another big week and hopefully another touchdown from Jordan Addison. Moving on to our number 16, we have Christian Kirk. Speaking of consistency, my goodness, Christian Kirk has played extremely well. Coming off of a week in which he had 6 grabs, 90 receiving yards and a touchdown, bailed out that performance with a final reception all the way to the house. An incredible overall game. We'll take it. From weeks 2 through 7, Christian Kirk is averaging 8.7 targets, 6.3 receptions, 78 receiving yards, a half a touchdown per game, and 13.68 fantasy points per game. What can I do besides start him? On top of the fact that he takes on the Pittsburgh Steelers, they are literally the second best matchup at the position. They just got cooked by Puka Nacua. And if you rewind this overall video and go back to Puka Nacua's overall, route chart, you can tell that all he was doing was running crossing routes. That's it. And what does Christian Kirk do best? Run crossing routes. And that's exactly what he's going to do against this defense. find himself open. We have seen a lot of wide receivers dominate against this secondary. I'm anticipating Christian Kirk, who as of thus far this season, since week 2, is not only wide receiver 16 in terms of fantasy points per game on average, but also wide receiver 10 in total fantasy points to have himself a fantastic performance. Moving on to our number 17, we have Jaylen Waddle. This last week against the New England Patriots, only had 6 catches for 63 yards, but that primarily had to do with the fact that he left the game due to an injury. He literally only played 45% of the offensive snaps and still had himself 6 catches for 63 yards. So imagine what he would have been able to accomplish in a full workload of a game, especially in that given matchup. Now he has an opportunity of taking on a division rival in the New England Patriots. They played against one another earlier this season. In that game, 4 catches for 86 yards. And in that game as well, ended up leaving due to an injury. Only played 73% of the offensive snaps. Obviously, in that game against New England, he suffered a concussion, didn't play in week 3. But again, in the opportunities that he is given, when healthy, Jaylen Waddle is an efficient wide receiver, and he's going to continue to ball out. We know that Bill Belichick always wants to take away the number one receiving threat of an offense, the number one option of an offense. That is going to be Tyreek Hill. He's going to do everything that he possibly can in order to slow down Tyreek Hill. When he does, Jaylen Waddle on the opposite side of the field will have himself an ample set of opportunity. And with that, hopefully can not only find the end zone, but get enough yardage to be a relevant fantasy option within the given week. Moving on to our number 18, we have Chris Olave. Now, there was a lot of news coming out on Monday night that Chris Olave was arrested. I don't anticipate that being a problem. He is still going to suit up. He is still going to play going into this upcoming weekend's matchup against the Indianapolis Colts. The biggest issue for Chris Olave isn't the speeding ticket being arrested. The biggest issue is Derek Carr. Thus far this season, Derek Carr ranks 29th amongst all quarterbacks in terms of on-target passing attempts. He is extremely inaccurate. Thus far this season, in terms of bad throwing percentages amongst all quarterbacks, he is only ahead of guys like Stroud, Pickett, Love, AR-15, which of course is Anthony Richardson, and Bryce Young. He's only ahead of rookie or second year or first year starting quarterbacks that are inexperienced in their careers. And how long has Derek Carr been in the league for? And he's still making these terrible mistakes. Nonetheless, he has an opportunity. He'll probably throw the ball 50 plus times again this upcoming week, taking on the Indianapolis Colts. Thus far this season, we've seen a fair share of wide receivers that have found themselves success against this defense. So Chris Olave, despite the fact that he is getting a boatload of inaccurate targets that are unfortunately 15 yards out of bounds, and he's still getting an earful from Derek Carr, we should end up still seeing a great performance out of Chris Olave. I mean, D-Hop, 8 catches for 140. Puka, 9 catches for 163. Nico Collins, 7 catches for 146. Calvin Ridley in week 1, 8 catches for 101. Why not Chris Olave this week? Moving on to our number 9, we have Michael Pittman Jr. Speaking of the Indianapolis Colts matchup, Michael Pittman Jr. last week, I didn't anticipate him to have an incredible game. As I mentioned, the Cleveland Browns defense, locked down. But somehow, some way, the Indianapolis Colts and Minshew Mania ran wild. Now, if it wasn't for the terrible tackling and the terrible performance of that secondary, Michael Pittman Jr. doesn't have himself a 15-point performance, because late in that game, an easy scheduled 15-yard pass down the middle of the defense turns into a 60-plus yard touchdown within the offense, primarily because 2 missed tackles, and there goes Michael Pittman Jr. for a touchdown. Fantastic. We take it every single week. Thus far this season, in the 3 games in which Gardner Minshew has been the primary starter of this offense, we have seen Michael Pittman Jr. targeted 11, 14, and most recently 5 times. Again, 5 times, not really a surprise, especially considering the difficult matchup. They take on the New Orleans Saints. As long as he continues to be the number 1 receiving option of this offense, regardless of who's covering him going up against the New Orleans Saints, the expectation is a fantastic performance for Michael Pittman Jr. Moving on to our number 20, George Pickens. George Pickens has taken steps forward thus far this season in comparison to last year. Truly has been putting up some great performances over the course of the last 4 weeks. In specific, since week 2, we have seen George Pickens averaging 8.2 targets, 4.4 receptions, 93 receiving yards per game, 0.4 receiving touchdowns, and 14.2 fantasy points per game, coming off of another consecutive week of over 100 receiving yards. The expectation taking on the Jacksonville Jaguars, who are the 10th best matchup at the position, is that the number 1 wide receiver of this offense, which should be George Pickens, should have himself a fantastic performance. We have seen number 1 wide receivers such as Michael Pittman Jr., 9 catches for 109. Stephon Diggs, 8 catches for 121 and a touchdown. Even Gabe Davis on the opposite side of the field, 6 catches for 100 and a touchdown. Tank Dell earlier this year, 5 catches for 145 and a touchdown. George Pickens should be in line for a fantastic performance this week. Moving on to our number 21, we have Zay Flowers. Zay Flowers has played extremely well this season. And, even though he had himself 4 catches for 75 against the Detroit Lions, and many of you may think, well, that was an underwhelming performance. It could have been far better. I agree with you. It could have been far better. The reason why it wasn't more is because the last time that Zay Flowers caught a ball in that game was with 3 minutes left in the second quarter. He literally didn't catch a singular pass in the second half because Why would he have to? They were already up 28 plus points at that point in time. So the expectation was, all right, well, we don't really have to, pepper any of these receivers with targets on a consistent basis in the second half. Let's run the ball, let's kill the clock, and let's get out of here. This upcoming week, he has the privilege of taking on the Arizona Cardinals. It is the 5th best matchup at the position. Not only did they give up, 60 yards and a touchdown to JSN last week, they gave up 60 yards and a touchdown to Jake Bobo. I mean, they have allowed a lot of points. Cooper Kupp, 7 catches, 148. Jamar Chase, 15 catches, 192. Both those guys scored a touchdown. Brandon Ayuk with 6 catches for 148. Zay Flowers should have himself a fantastic performance within a great matchup. Moving on to our number 22, we have Garrett Wilson coming off the bye week. Since week 1, we have seen Garrett Wilson averaging 9 targets, 5 catches, 62 receiving yards, and 1 touchdown every 3 games. So the expectation is that with his 10.82 fantasy point per game average, he should still be a relevant option, top 24 capacity within the given week, taking on the New York Giants. The New York Giants, of course, are going to be sending a lot of pressure in the direction of Zach Wilson in order to kind of force him to make uncomfortable throws. But as long as Garrett Wilson continues to see a high volume of targets, he has had himself 12 plus targets in 2 out of the last 3 games that he has participated in. Of course, he is still going to continue to maintain fantasy relevancy and hopefully find the end zone within this given week. Moving on to our number 23, we have Nico Collins coming off the bye week as well. From weeks 1 through 6, Nico Collins has been averaging 7 targets, 5 catches, 92 receiving yards, and a half a touchdown per game, 1 out of every 2 games. 14.53 fantasy points per game. Incredible overall production. Throughout that span of time, an 11.9 ADOT, that's average depth of target down the field. He ranks 7 amongst all receiving options in terms of yards after the catch, while also maintaining a 20% target share within this offense. The expectation going up against the Carolina Panthers is that we may see a lot of one-on-one coverage against J.C. Horn, one of the better cornerbacks in the National Football League. Even with that being the case, most recently, J.C. Horn has given up 10 catches for 100 to Stephon Diggs and 6 catches for 90 to Terry McLaurin. I know that Nico Collins isn't of the caliber of those 2 wide receivers yet, but he'll potentially be catching up to Terry McLaurin as we continue to progress. And of course, CJ Stroud continues to get better thus far this season, hopefully improving his overall accuracy as a quarterback and allowing Nico Collins to get more potential upside with those opportunities being on target for him within the given weeks. Moving on to our number 24, we have Josh Downs. I mean, Josh Downs is becoming one of my favorite wide receivers. What he was able to accomplish last week, very impressive. 5 catches, 125 and a touchdown. Has an opportunity of taking on Alontae Taylor. We talked about this last week with Christian Kirk. Alontae Taylor, amongst all nickel cornerbacks in the National Football League, has allowed the most targets, receptions, receiving yards, and receiving touchdowns to slot receiving options. Therefore, we're anticipating Josh Downs to have himself another great performance. Back-to-back weeks of a receiving touchdown from Gardner Minshew. On top of the fact that he's been able to garner a 20% target share within this offense, I'm anticipating another big performance here from Josh Downs. Moving on to our number 25, we have Drake London of the Atlanta Falcons. If it wasn't for the fact that he was just mere inches short of scoring a touchdown, I mean, Drake London runs off to the sideline, reaches for the pylon, is just barely short of scoring a touchdown. But besides Drake London's could have been plays within the red zone, there were also some mistakes from the Atlanta Falcons offense that purely did kind of lower the overall potential of the fantasy upside of the receiving options within this team. I mean, besides the fact that Desmond Ridder quite literally fumbled out of the back of the end zone, there could have been chances for Drake London to have himself an even better performance. He still had himself 6 catches for 54, and thus far this season, he's looked great. I mean, since week 2, he's garnering a 23% target share within this offense. Now he has an opportunity of taking on the Tennessee Titans, the 8th best matchup of the position. They just lost Kevin Byard. That secondary may be in shambles as their primary leader is not going to be there. Drake London in line for another great performance as Desmond Ridder continues to play well. I mean, again, this offense should have blown out the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. The amount of times that they turn it over in the red zone was ridiculous on Sunday. If they continue to clean those up, of course, Drake London should be a fantastic play. Moving on to our number 26, we have Terry McLaurin. He takes on the Philadelphia Eagles back in week 4 in the matchup. 10 targets, 8 catches, 86 yards, recovered a fumble for a touchdown, put up 18 fantasy points. In 3 of the last 4 games, has been able to get himself 9 or more targets, 80 plus receiving yards, 10 plus fantasy points, consistent overall numbers. Going up against the Eagles this upcoming week, again, it's the 3rd best matchup at the position. They're allowing nearly 34 fantasy points per game. I'm expecting Terry McLaurin in a negative game script to absolutely be relevant within this upcoming weekend's matchup against the division rival in the Philadelphia Eagles, which earlier this season, again, played very well against. Moving on to number 27, speaking of the Philadelphia Eagles, let's talk about Devonta Smith. You guys can see the next-gen stats route tree. This route tree was not from last week. This route tree is primarily from the matchup against the Washington Commanders in week 4. I just want to go ahead and give you guys a little bit of an understanding just how much opportunity Devonta Smith was given in that game. In that game, only had 7 catches for 78 yards and 11.3 fantasy points and a half PPR. But in that game, 12.5 ADOT and 105 total air yards. There was multiple opportunities of deep shots down the field in order for Devonta Smith to have himself an incredible overall performance. Many opportunities, unfortunately, was not able to come down with the ball. There is a chance this upcoming week, with those opportunities, could absolutely make a play, similar to what we've seen other wide receivers against this defense do, whether it is Jalen Hyatt, Marvin Mims, it doesn't matter, DJ Morris. A lot of wide receivers have dominated against this defense. Why not Devonta Smith as the number 2? I know he has been very underwhelming as of late, but the matchup in itself truly does elevate his potential. Moving on to our number 28, we have Josh Palmer. I know that Josh Palmer didn't practice earlier today, and I'm hoping he'll be healthy for this upcoming weekend's matchup against the Chicago Bears, because he finally found himself a great overall performance against the Kansas City Chiefs. Again, last season against Kansas City Chiefs, balled out once again this week. 5 catches, 133. Fantastic. Primarily going up against the Chicago Bears, it's going to be a pass-heavy game. You want to go ahead and attack that defense at what they do the worst. And what they do worst is cover. They have been very good in terms of stopping the run as of late. So if, in fact, Keenan Allen is going to pull his coverage, not going to be open on some circumstances, of course, in the absence of Mike Williams, Joshua Palmer is going to have to continue to have these big performances in order for this offense and this team to find success. Moving on to our number 29, we have DK Metcalf. I know that DK Metcalf didn't play last week, and we're not 100% certain as to what his health looks like going into this week. And they do take on the Cleveland Browns. Again, this is a lot of negatives going into the week. Taking on Denzel Ward as the primary man coverage. Again, this team is run the most man coverage and most single high safety coverage amongst all teams in the National Football League thus far this season from weeks 1 through 7. So the expectation is that DK Metcalf, going up against a very difficult matchup, may have a tough time. But thus far this season, averaging 6.4 targets, 4.4 receptions, 67 receiving yards, 0.4 receiving touchdowns per game, which comes out to 11.34 fantasy points per game. That level of opportunity, only 6.4 targets per game, unless he's going to make a reception like Michael Pittman Jr. did and go for 75 yards and a touchdown, which he's certainly capable of doing. It's going to be a tough matchup within the week, especially coming off the injury. Moving on to our number 30, DJ Moore. Just look at the route tree. Just understand how easy they made it for Tyson Bagent as the rookie, quarterback, D2 quarterback specifically within this offense. They wanted to allow him to throw the ball short, intermediate passes, get the ball out of his hands extremely quickly, and allow DJ Moore to make plays after the catch. DJ Moore had himself 8 receptions, but only a total of 54 receiving yards. If they're not going to allow Tyson Bagent to throw the ball deep down the field and get a couple shots every single game, of course, the overall upside of DJ Moore is going to be limited. It is an advantageous matchup, specifically taking on the Los Angeles Chargers. It is the best matchup of the week. I'm anticipating that DJ Moore may not have enough upside because of the quarterback play. And because of that, I have him at number 30. But just keep in mind, if they get him a little bit more comfortable with throwing the ball deep, hopefully DJ Moore will have himself a couple opportunities there and could end up making himself a play and getting himself into the top 15 conversation at the end of the week. Moving on to our number 31, we have Courtland Sutton. Courtland Sutton, week 6 against the Kansas City Chiefs. 4 catches, 46 and a touchdown. This week he takes on that defense, and even though he had a 12.6 fantasy point performance in the last time out, he had 3 of his overall 4 receptions quite literally in the fourth quarter. The offense of the Denver Broncos was shut out in the first 3 quarters of that game and did nothing. If there's going to be another one of those performances, I am worried for Courtland Sutton, but luckily for him, he has scored at least 1 touchdown in 5 of the last 7 games. Amongst all receiving options in the National Football League, he is tied for the most red zone receiving touchdowns this season. Just putting that into perspective, just so you understand just how valuable of a piece Courtland Sutton has been for that offense. Now, this last week, there were multiple opportunities for Courtland Sutton to have an even better performance than 6 catches for 76 and a touchdown, which you may think, 16 fantasy points, that's fantastic, Andrew. How could he be even better? The offense for the Denver Broncos in the red zone was awful. I think they were 1 for 4, 1 for 5 in the red zone, made a lot of mistakes, had a lot of field goals from Will Lutz. If they go ahead and clean that up and potentially attack this Kansas City defense early and often and are able to at least put up a performance within the first 3 quarters, unlike the last time they took each other on, there's a potential in which Courtland Sutton should once again have another great performance. Moving on to our number 32, Marquise Hollywood-Brown. He has a revenge game against his former team, the Baltimore Ravens. We heard that earlier today, Kyler Murray fully participated in practice. If Kyler Murray is going to suit up for this week, I'm just putting it out there. Marquise Hollywood Brown would be a significantly higher ranked wide receiver. I mean, we go back to last season, in the games in which Marquise Hollywood Brown played with Kyler Murray, he was averaging over 11 targets per game and incredible performances on a consistent basis. So if in fact they're going to be in a negative game script as anticipated taking on the Baltimore Ravens, we should see a lot of targets go in the direction of Marquise Hollywood Brown, whether it is Kyler or Josh Dobbs. As of right now, 32 with Josh Dobbs could be a little bit higher if Kyler Murray is in fact active within the given week. Moving on to our number 33, we have Chris Godwin. Chris Godwin, like I mentioned last week on the video for wide receiver rankings, hopefully was going to move into the slot position in order to take advantage of the matchup against the Atlanta Falcons and Dee Alford being one of the lesser nickel cornerbacks in the National Football League in terms of slot coverage, and that's exactly what we saw. We saw Chris Godwin move into the slot position, play 48% of his overall snaps there, and had himself a solid week of 6 catches in 66 yards, but had himself 12 targets. If in fact a little bit more of those overall opportunities were, catchable and or potentially a little bit more accurate, of course, Chris Godwin has himself an even better week. We have most recently seen wide receivers like Demario Douglas, who played 92% of his overall snaps in the slot position, 5 catches for 54. Christian Kirk, 6 catches for 78. Wan'Dale Robinson, 8 catches for 62. All of these slot receiving options against Buffalo in the last 3 games, there's potential for Chris Godwin to have himself another relevant performance. Moving on to our number 34, T. Higgins. I don't know what we're going to see out of T. Higgins. What really does put fear in my heart is Devonta Smith and Jalen Waddle. And you may be thinking, why is that the case, Andrew? They haven't played against San Francisco this year. It's wide receiver 2s that are next to an elite wide receiver 1 like Ja'Marr Chase, like A.J. Brown, like Tyreek Hill. Those wide receiver 2s this season haven't been able to be extremely relevant for fantasy purposes, and that is my concern. I am afraid that T. Higgins, even though it's an advantageous matchup, taking on a secondary that couldn't stop a soul on Monday Night Football against the Minnesota Vikings, on top of the fact that T. Higgins is finally fully healthy due to the rib injury that he sustained a couple of weeks ago. Joe Burrow should be fully healthy from the calf injury. This offense is coming off a bye week, having prepared for this defense for multiple weeks. There should be a situation here where T. Higgins should have touchdown upside, absolutely, without a doubt. I'm just a little concerned about it. Therefore, I have him at number 34. I just want to be cautious with him. I don't want to go ahead and overrank him, considering there have been so many wide receivers playing extremely well thus far this season. Moving on to our number 35, we have Amari Cooper. Amari Cooper's played extremely well. Again, in the absence of Deshaun Watson, he is still getting himself a good workload of opportunity. Unfortunately, this last week, only 2 catches, 22 yards, but was open on multiple instances late in that game. Again, a lot of penalties called on the cornerback that was covering Amari Cooper late in that game. Obviously, the refs made a couple, mistakes there. Nonetheless, Amari Cooper, in the absence of Deshaun Watson with PJ Walker, has had himself a 100-yard receiving performance. Has to take on the Seattle Seahawks. The only worry that I have taking on the Seahawks, and the reason why I have Amari Cooper so low ranked in comparison to the rest of the field, is the fact that as of late, since the Seahawks secondary has gotten healthy, they've been able to lock down guys like Ja'Marr Chase and Marquise Hollywood Brown. So that does kind of instill a little bit of fear in my heart in regards to the potential upside of Amari Cooper. It's not impossible for him to have himself a great performance. I'm just thinking that it's going to be a little bit tougher with a backup quarterback in the overall matchup. Moving on to our number 36. Many of you were waiting for the name. It is Calvin Ridley. Thus far this season, the bad performances that Calvin Ridley has had hasn't really been a Calvin Ridley issue. This is a Doug Peterson, Trevor Lawrence issue. The fact that Jamal Agnew is garnering more targets within the offense than Calvin Ridley just kind of gives you an understanding as to this offense's lack of priority to get him the ball on a consistent basis. When you're looking towards Jamal Agnew on a 3rd down play where you need to get a 1st down, instead you're throwing a pick to Marshawn Lattimore instead of looking the direction to one of your other elite wide receivers, go for it. Throw the ball to Jamal Agnew, but this is not a Calvin Ridley issue. I mean, truly, the way that they've schemed up opportunities for Calvin Ridley thus far this season, he's running a tightrope on the sideline. Almost every opportunity this man is being given is in tight window scenarios. I mean, we're talking about on the sideline, barely able to get your feet down and hoping that the ball isn't 5 yards off of the sideline into the crowd. Like, that's truly what we're hoping. And with that being the case, I'm hoping that this offense can readjust, get themselves and their top receiver involved. But, as long as Christian Kirk continues to garner a high volume of targets, and so does Travis Etienne out of the backfield, of course, guys like Evan Ingram, Calvin Ridley, until Doug Peterson and Trevor Lawrence want to specifically go ahead and take advantage of the opportunity that they have a talented wide receiver on the outside, until they want to take advantage of it, we'll just have to go ahead and leave him on our bench. And until then, kind of wait and see what happens. It's a great matchup against Pittsburgh. I just don't know if I can trust Calvin Ridley because I can't trust Trevor Lawrence or Doug Peterson. Moving on to our number 37, Rashee Rice. Rashee Rice has played incredibly well thus far this season. He is obviously Patrick Mahomes' number one receiving option as a wide receiver on this team. Obviously, when Travis Kelce's on the opposite side of the field, having himself 100-yard receiving games within just the first half of games, obviously this is going to open up more opportunities on the opposite side of the field for someone like Rashee Rice. Thus far this season, what Rashee Rice has done within this offense is primarily catch a lot of touchdowns. And of course, coming off another performance of scoring a touchdown, amongst all receiving options, he's number 10 in terms of red zone targets. Amongst all receiving options, he's number 3 in terms of receiving touchdowns inside the 10-yard line. In the last time out against the Denver Broncos, Rashee Rice 4 catches for 72 in an okay performance. But in that game, the Kansas City Chiefs were 1 for 5 in the red zone. They cleaned that up. They kick less field goals. They're going to be in a situation where Rashee Rice probably finds himself in the end zone once again and probably is a 10 to 11 plus fantasy point player within the given week, hopefully, if he finds himself in the end zone. Again, he doesn't have to. There's guys like Marquez Valdes-Scantling, Kadarius Toney, Sky Moore, McCole Hardman, who they just added, Pacheco, McKinnon, Clyde Edwards, Travis Kelce, Noah Gray. They have so many options and there's so many cooks in the kitchen. He doesn't have to score every week, but I'm hoping that Patrick Mahomes continues to build more of a rapport with him and continues to send the ball in his direction. Moving on to our number 38, we have Diontae Johnson. Played relatively well in his first game back. I mean, he had a 24% target share, only played 66% of the offensive snaps. I'm sure that number is only going to increase as he goes ahead and gets more comfortable. Obviously, he's coming off a hamstring injury, so they wanted to be a little bit protective of his overall usage, but a 24% target share, fantastic. Has the 10th best matchup at the position, taking on the Jacksonville Jaguars. Like I mentioned earlier with George Pickens, outside wide receivers, Pittman, 9 catches, 109. Diggs, 8 catches, 121 and a touchdown. Tank Dell, 5 catches for 145. And even Gabe Davis, 6 catches for 100 and a touchdown. Diontae Johnson in line for potentially another great week here. Hopefully he can score a touchdown and get off of the streak of games in which he hasn't scored a touchdown in, 17 games? But that's kind of wishful thinking as of right now. Moving on to our number 39. Speaking of scoring touchdowns, Kendrick Bourne's coming off a game where he had 6 catches, 63 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown. In the last 2 weeks with, Mac Jones, of course, playing well. 11 targets in week 6, 7 targets in week 7. Fantastic. We'll take it. But the fact of the matter is, going forward, Mac Jones should be the starting quarterback of this offense. I mean, Mac Jones played well enough last week to the point to where they went ahead and they took Malik Cunningham, who they signed to a 3-year deal to the active roster. He was a practice squad quarterback. They signed him to the roster for a 3-year deal. A week later, they cut him because of how well Mac Jones played. And it just goes to show you what the heck is going on with the New England Patriots. But nonetheless, as long as Kendrick Bourne continues to see himself a steady volume of targets, of course, it's going to continue to be a relevant option. Majority of his receptions close to the line of scrimmage. We'll take it any way we can get it. Fantasy points, Kendrick Bourne, as long as he continues to catch the ball on a consistent basis, I'm happy with it. Moving on. We have number 40 through 45. Like I mentioned, we're mentioning our top 45 wide receivers. I wanted to go ahead and just pair these all together because a lot of these players, they may have upside while there may be a little bit sketchy plays. Christian Watson. Obviously, should he be expected to play this week? I mean, that's kind of what I've read. The fact that he had a 7.2 average depth of target last week is unacceptable, especially considering he's a 4.4 speed kind of guy. 7.2 ADOT is for guys like Luke Musgrave. It's not for guys like Christian Watson. So hopefully they'll clean that up, especially with an advantageous matchup taking on the Minnesota Vikings. Gabe Davis, if you think he is going to score a touchdown this week, you have to start him. Because anytime he scores a touchdown, of course, he's fantasy relevant. Outside of those performances, it has been extremely bleak as of the last 2 weeks, so be careful with him. Tyler Lockett hasn't scored a touchdown in quite a while, yet he has still been able to command an average depth of target of 10 plus yards every single week this season. Eventually, he's going to have himself a great game. Unfortunately, the touchdowns went in the direction of JSN and Jake Bobo last week. Hopefully, Tyler Lockett can go ahead and get back on track and put together a great performance. Again, without a touchdown, Tyler Lockett, a tough play, to say the very least, against the Cleveland Browns. Michael Thomas should be able to take advantage of the advantageous matchup against the Indianapolis Colts. Of course, him and Rashid Shaheed could both be in this position, but primarily it's a matter of who's going to get the end zone targets or red zone targets within the given week to elevate their overall play. Curtis Samuel, speaking of red zone opportunities, Curtis Samuel this last week, 4 catches for 25 yards. Very similar to Gabe Davis. If you think he's going to score a touchdown, you should start him. I want to go ahead and just put it out there. When I watched back the games this week, I was looking specifically for Curtis Samuel. Why didn't he score? He had 8 targets, only 4 catches. What was the issue? There was an opportunity in that game with 10 minutes, and I think 30 seconds left in the third quarter, in which down in the red zone on the 4-yard line, in shotgun, snaps the ball, throws it in the direction of Curtis Samuel. Curtis Samuel got jammed up at the line of scrimmage, wasn't able to get away from his defender, and because of that, wasn't able to score. But for a fourth consecutive week, they designed a play in order to get Curtis Samuel open in the red zone. Very promising. Hopefully can find himself in the end zone, taking on the Philadelphia Eagles. Last time he took them on, of course, found himself a touchdown. The final player I wanted to mention is DeAndre Hopkins. DeAndre Hopkins will have Will Levis as a starting quarterback this week. I don't know if Will Levis is the next coming or if Will Levis is just going to be another one of these average, below average quarterbacks who really cannot throw the ball on a consistent basis. Time will tell. The Tennessee Titans take on the Atlanta Falcons. It is not an easy matchup taking on AJ Terrell, but it's not impossible for a wide receiver of the capacity of DeAndre Hopkins. We're just going to hope that DeAndre Hopkins can somewhat be relevant, even though the quarterback play that is associated with him is not up to par. Nonetheless, that's going to cover it for me today. Thank you everybody for watching. If you haven't yet already, subscribe to the channel, click the like button, comment down below. Also, if you guys haven't checked out Underdog Fantasy, be sure to go ahead and do so today. Get my rankings every single Sunday. Take advantage of course, the Josh Allen play for tomorrow's Thursday night campaign. Of course, NBA tip-off started yesterday. You can continue to put together some pick'em slips via the NBA contests that are upcoming today, tomorrow, etc. Thank you everybody for watching. Use code Andrew. And until next time, which I'll be talking about tight end and quarterback rankings tomorrow, I'll see you guys. Peace.